Welcome, everybody, to the Hedgehog Evening Discussion. Tonight, we'll be talking with Kyle Edward Williams about his new book, Taming the Octopus. Hopefully, some of you had a chance to look at the reading that was sent out, but if not, I think the discussion will still be inviting and intelligible. Kyle is senior editor of the Hedgehog Review and also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. He's an historian. And tonight we'll be talking about his book, which looks at the history of the corporation and also delves into what I would consider some topics of metaphysics, talking about what the essence of the corporation is and what is it for, the teleology of the corporation. You may not like those terms, but they may come up. My name is Paul Nedelisky. I'm assistant director and fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, where we study cultural change from many different perspectives across the disciplines. The format tonight will be Kyle will kick things off with some introductory comments. He'll probably talk about 10 or 15 minutes. And then I will most likely abuse my privilege as moderator to ask the first question. But in the meantime, while Kyle is talking, and as you're thinking about what you may want to ask, feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your question. So not the chat, although you're free to chat as well. But if you want to ask a question, write it there in the Q&A, and I'll look through those. And if we have too many of them, I'll do some triage. But otherwise, I'll just read your questions from the Q&A, and Kyle will answer them, and we'll carry the discussion forward. Before we hop in, I do want to make one brief announcement. We'll be hosting another event in this genre, another evening discussion with the Hedgehog, in about a month's time on I believe it's April 23rd, with philosopher Tal Brewer, talking about an essay of his called The Great Malformation, discussing child rearing in an age of digital technology. So if you like what you hear tonight, please join us again for that as well. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Kyle to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for doing this with me. It's good to have you on board. And thank you all for being here tonight. I wanted to start off talking for a few minutes about the excerpt from the book that we shared. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, the link is on the Zoom invitation description, and we'll also put a link to it in the YouTube description later. It comes from the sixth chapter of the book, and it focuses on this period of mass social and political movements in the 1960s and early 1970s. And I wanted to recall this moment from the book and this period, because I think if you sit with it for a while and pull back the layers, the parallels to our current situation are pretty striking. And I think they help provide I hope, a fresh window and a helpful perspective on controversies that we're seeing today over things like ESG and woke capitalism and that kind of thing. So I'll just jump into this. The corporate protests in the period of the late 60s and early 70s focused on major publicly traded corporations. And they called for change in a variety of areas. Civil rights, of course, was a big part of this, but the civil rights movement had a way of kind of spilling out into many other interests and causes and movements. And so they also focused on gender equality and consumer safety, environmental pollution, workers' rights, and many other things. And these corporate protests targeted primarily annual shareholders meetings. Those annual meetings are actually coming up in a couple of months in the United States. And they're usually in the spring, they're usually very boring and predictable, except for those times when they're not. And in those years, in the late 60s and early 70s, they were not boring and predictable. The meetings of AT&T and Boeing and Bank of America and many other these companies became dramatic sites of conflict between activists on the one hand and management. And although this era of protests reached a head in the early 70s, it actually originated much earlier. And I write about this in some earlier chapters of the book. The first evidence that I know of activists buying shares of a company and protesting the annual meeting and demanding change happened about 20 years before. And what happened was there were a couple of activists associated with CORE. Baird Rustin, who's probably the most well-known of them, and his colleague James Peck bought shares of the Greyhound Bus Company. And they attempted to introduce a resolution demanding integration of bus lines in the American South in the late 40s and early 50s. Of course, this was the era of the freedom rides and other kinds of direct civil rights activism. And so bus lines were a big part of their strategy and was really important. Um, Fast forward about 15 years later, and Black Power activists in Rochester, New York, were doing the same thing. Though I don't know of any evidence that they knew about what Peck and Russin had done with Greyhound. The Rochester group received a lot of national media attention because they bought shares of the Eastman Kodak Company, and they launched protests against Kodak. And what they wanted was the company to create a jobs training program for hundreds of untrained inner city workers and to hire them. The organizer and activist Saul Alinsky helped with that project and publicized their tactics. And then by 1970, we kind of get back to the context of the chapter that we shared, the consumer safety activist and corporate gadfly Ralph Nader helped launch the campaign to make General Motors responsible, which is probably the most sophisticated and highly coordinated of these campaigns in the 70s. And what collectively these protests forced corporate America to develop what we could now kind of identify as the modern corporate social responsibility movement. Now, I was trained as a historian, as Paul said, and the question that historians always have to get around to, or you would hope that they get around to eventually, is the so what question. So why does this history matter? I think there's a lot of reasons why it matters, but for me, what I find interesting and what is kind of the focus of this book project is that it's a story about how people began to think differently about the large corporation, at least in that moment in time. Now there are a lot of businesses that show up in this book, but the focus of the book is not on one particular business or a case study of an industry. The focus is on the corporation. And what I mean by that is the particular and specific, like institutional form that the largest and most powerful and successful businesses have taken over the last 100 years or so. And that form is the large publicly traded corporation. And so I'm interested as an intellectual historian in ideas, and I'm interested in how people use ideas and they think about problems and they produce ideas and they reuse them and they apply them, and that kind of messy question about the relationship between ideas and historical change. And so the question that I've been thinking about in this book is sort of what have people thought about what a corporation is and what is a corporation for? And I'm interested not primarily in intellectuals, though they do show up, but they do show up in the story, but in business people and activists and workers and as much as I can, sort of everyday people. And so in the activist movements of the late 60s and early 70s, you witness a shift in thinking about these kind of questions. So just to take the example of the Black Power activists in Rochester, New York that I mentioned, those the ones who protested Kodak and demanded jobs for disadvantaged workers. If you listen carefully to what they said, you start to hear something important. Although Kodak was a private business, a part of private industry in a technical sense, the activists believed that it was more than just a private company. It was a part of the Rochester community. And in those years, the company employed about 41,000 people. And of course, Rochester it's not a big city. And so it was a kind of company town. From their perspective, Kodak belonged to the community belonged to it. And they were in a moral sense kind of members of one another. Another that could sound maybe naive or Pollyannish, but I think for them they took it deadly seriously. They had a moral critique of this company. And so the coalition of Black Power activists, these church pastors and priests, and members of the community, they believe that Kodak existed, or at least it should exist for the good of all of its members. And that's what made it so particularly objectionable that the company employed so few African Americans. So this is a sort of moral and political claim about what corporations are and what they're for. And it harkens back to an older tradition in American life and in American thinking about corporations that has a deep sort of legal history. We could talk a little bit about it if we want tonight. But in this view, corporations are not just collections of separate atomized individuals who happen to be doing business together. They're also not. They also don't just exist solely for the benefit of shareholders. I mean, it's hard for us to kind of get back behind that history and remember that most people living before the 1980s, the idea that corporations exist primarily for the benefit of shareholders would have struck them as a very strange idea. And so the way that I think about all of this, about the corporation, about the history of the corporation, is deeply influenced by a man named Adolf Berle. I write about him in the book, and he was a New Deal lawyer. He was a policymaker, and but he had a real kind of sociological mind, and he thought about the corporation as a kind of field of relationships among workers, consumers, shareholders, and other financial investors, managers, directors. All of these groups or constituencies, or if you want to use the word stakeholder, they all have relationships with one another that are relationships of power, they're relationships of culture, they're relationships of business, and they're governed by these rules and norms that are inscribed in law and in custom and in ideology. And the two intersecting concerns, of course, I have in the book are about power on the one hand and responsibility on the other. And the engine that sort of drives the action, so it depends on the moment that we're talking about. The 60s and 70s were a pretty special moment and a pretty dramatic one. But the thing that I'm interested in, the through line, might be termed the legitimation or the exercise of proper authority, to use kind of Hannah Arendt language. But I'm very influenced by this kind of question of the legitimation of authority, the proper exercise of power. And as with the exercise of authority in just about every modern case, the exercise of corporate authority is problematic. I'm trying to dig into what that problem is and how it's settled or unsettled. And so, it seems clear to me that the corporation is a kind of interruption, a suspension, a kind of attenuation of the free market to a certain degree. And by virtue of charters and other rules, the corporation is constituted by grants of privileges and rights that allow it to grow and at scale and conduct and coordinate economic activity. It's not so much an argument that I make in the book as it's a kind of assumption that I accept that the corporation is a kind of concession of state power, really influenced by David Seepley and others who have made this case. And this was very much the kind of common sense view in American life in the 19th century and earlier. And so I don't want to go off too much into the weeds on that, but it's that perspective, is that way of thinking about the corporation that makes me convinced and made me convinced when I started working on this project that we have to recover and think about the language of power and authority when thinking about corporate institutions. All right, almost done. At stake in all of this is, I think, the question of corporate purpose. What purpose do corporations serve? And this question has not vanished. It's actually only becoming more pressing. And it's one of the reasons that the politics of corporate power and what you might call the corporate culture war is becoming increasingly volatile. In our political culture today, there are revived concerns about corporations, revived interest in what role they can play or should play in society, renewed skepticism, even anxiety about concentrated power. This plays out in a variety of different ways, but you can see it in the words of CEOs who promise to be good social leaders and steer their company for the good of all stakeholders. You can see it in the expectation that people have that corporations take the lead in solving social and political problems. You can also see it conversely in the backlash to those kinds of initiatives, the severe skepticism that, are CEOs really the ones to be tackling these big social and political problems? Isn't that anti-democratic, for example? Or boycotts of brands like Target and Bud Light. There's a lot of examples we can all think of. My argument is that behind this, that both the expectations of social responsibility and the backlash to them is the view that corporations are not simply private institutions, that they must serve some purpose. And so that's because what's good, because what's moral is sort of the deeper question underlying all of this. That's what I think makes these conflicts so intense and so difficult for people to even talk about. So that's what I'm trying to do, is talk about it. And I'll stop with that.
Kyle, thanks for that. It's an interesting overview, and kind of sticking with your central concern of, I think this question touches on questions of legitimacy.
Yeah.
I was thinking about a story that was in chapter 6 about the political activists, and I was thinking of the account of the General Motors board meeting where many of the activists appeared. They spoke for something like 5 or 6 hours, and were really were able to make their case. Kind of rattled the board members. Presented their arguments, made some strong points, but in the end, it was interesting. If I'm recalling correctly, the proposals they presented still lost something like 97% to 3% in terms of the vote of the shareholders. I mean, now in some of the cases you describe, the protesters are calling for the corporation in question to adhere to an existing law, or but in this case, it's not clear that was happening. In there are other cases later on that you describe, the cases of boycotts, for instance, Nike in the 90s and early 2000s, when it became known some of their practices in their factories overseas, it clearly affected their sales. And so there was sort of the causal mechanism, how it was the complaints had traction, on the boards of these companies, or on the managers of these companies, is clear. But in some of these cases, like the GM case, it wasn't totally clear why were the activists able to achieve some of their aims. Sure, they lost the vote in a landslide fashion, but in the end, they were able to induce the board of GM to move in their direction somewhat, despite really losing the vote. And so I was wondering, can you say more? Maybe is there something else going on that explains how they're able to be effective despite not having the vote, despite not having clear moral claim on the consciences of the board, or maybe that was playing a role. I guess I'm just asking for more clarification. How are they able to move the needle with the board when they were losing the vote? Why didn't the board just say, yes, you've yelled at us for 5 hours, but we have the votes and you don't, so see you next year?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in the conflict so for context for everyone, I read about a book about this, and I mentioned it briefly, the campaign to make General Motors responsible. That was what it was called. It started in 1970, and they had a good run for a few years, and they received a lot of press, and it was probably the most high profile protest against what was at the time the largest corporation in the United States, probably in the world, actually. And the conflict they had with GM was probably the most dramatic. One of the problems that managers had in those days was that they just weren't prepared for this kind of conflict at shareholders meetings, so that they were kind of caught off guard. They weren't really sure what to do. When you have a meeting year in and year out where people are pretty chummy and pretty friendly, and like there's just not a lot of conflict, you don't think about how to control a meeting. And I think that's one of the things that was going on. That's why it stretched on for so long. And there were hundreds of reporters, and it was a big media event. And so, I think one of the things I think that in order to understand why General Motors responded the way they did with these activists, I mean, I think you have to remember that in the late 60s, very early 70s was just a time of tremendous social change, and a kind of social and political crisis. I mean, it's particularly in the inner cities, particularly over matters of civil rights. And I think that business leaders recognized that and came to believe, even when they were standing up against activists at shareholders meetings, came to believe that they had some kind of social responsibility to solve these problems. The question, though, and the question, and how you understand which side won, is sort of the question about who gets power, who gets a seat at the table, right? The activist, the most well known of which, partly because he ran for president and still alive, Ralph Nader. What these activists were after was they wanted a real seat at the table. They didn't want power to be consolidated in directors and CEOs who didn't have accountability to social movements. And I think what the activists really thought was that they were on the cusp of a new era of engagement. Well, the way that the public would relate to corporations would change. Saul Alinsky envisioned this mass mobilization of middle-class shareholders, and he talked about wanting to host annual corporate meetings at Yankee Stadium in order to accommodate all the people that would be there. Sort of a silly idea in retrospect, but as a historian, I try to take those kinds of statements seriously. And I think that he really thought that something really profound was going to change. But for one thing happened, the middle class shareholders did not turn out. They were very skeptical, by and large, of what these young, hippie, student activist, types were up to. These are a lot of these shareholders were people who had worked for the company for decades, and they were blue collar kind of types, and so there's a cultural difference between them that I think was hard to overcome. They also just had a material interest in the success of the company, and so when you have activists coming and saying we need to completely rethink the social role of the large corporation, it's kind of an abstract idea for them. Their relationship to the corporation is just a lot more economic and material. And so anyway, to circle back around to the question of how they ended up having influence, I think from the perspective of these CEOs, many of which were pretty liberal-minded, a generation that came out of World War II, a generation that came out of the experience of the Great Depression and the New Deal liberalism. They had a pretty liberal perspective on these questions, but they were not willing to give one inch of executive power up. They wanted to accommodate these changes in a form of a compromise, that this would be management-led, that this would be on the terms of interest of management and of shareholders. And so maybe you could put it this way: the activists were making a moral claim, a political claim. They wanted a change in how power was held. And the sort of liberal business establishment was willing to meet them halfway and say, well, we'll try to meet your moral claims here, but we're not giving up on any power. And so they put money into black-owned banks, and they put a black man on the board of directors, and they started programs to bring in black owners of car dealerships, and they started programs of pollution mitigation, but they did these things on their own terms. So
it sounds like one way of thinking about that is that the managers and the board members, of these companies, they too are part of a broader culture. They work at a corporation, and the frequent question is, should the corporation have concerns beyond profitability for the shareholders? And the debate goes back and forth. And some people say, well, the corporation exists in a broader structure within society. So, of course, they need to be sensitive to these other implications. But kind of another way of looking at it is, yeah, and the people who work at the corporation themselves are human beings who don't only exist within some kind of insular world of the corporation. They read books. They have friends outside of their business. They are influenced by the times they live in. And so I just this thought hadn't occurred to me, but it's interesting. Yeah, it makes total sense that perhaps the moral and political arguments of these activists did get some traction, even if the corporations did want to, in the end, as much as possible, make the changes on their own terms.
Yeah,
so somehow that thought escaped me in the course of reading the book. But it's a good point.
You mean that the kinds of things that, like, the activists were making these demands on corporations because they were concerned about issues X, Y, and Z, but like the workers and the consumers and the shareholders themselves might have been concerned by those issues too, right? They could have.
Yeah, and you pointed out that the boards of these companies were often good liberal subjects, and I'm sure there were deep political divides in many cases, but no doubt some of the arguments found a target. Some of the questions were very awkward, and they didn't have good answers for them. And as is often the way of these things, we can avoid difficult questions until we're put on the spot. And so I'm interested in your response, and I think it shines a new light on these interactions, I think. We have a question. The question I think is about what I think you call the profitability issue with corporate social responsibility, or ESG, toward the end of the book. How strong is socially responsible investing? I think the term was the profitability question. That it often comes up. Yes, if, we can change an investment policy, an investment strategy, investment profile to avoid certain things or to emphasize certain things. And maybe this, scratches some moral itch, but is it also more profitable in the end? Is investing in, morally virtuous companies an economically winning strategy? Wonder if you could share some thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think that the approaching it as I like to do from a historical angle, the history of the profitability problem goes back to the 70s when people who were supportive of socially responsible investing by the early 70s, they were making a case for what they called peace portfolios, investment funds that wouldn't invest in the war industries, for example, during the era of Vietnam, and then these kind of funds grew in size. They were never super mainstream. They were pretty marginal kind of efforts, and they tended to be of interest to, like, as you might imagine, to religious organizations. A lot of Catholic foundations, religious foundations, and then liberal mainline denominations owned a lot of stocks. They have big endowments, and some universities did too, and they were interested in investment products that wouldn't get them involved in nasty business. And so, but a key part of sort of making a case for these funds was to say, not only is this not unprofitable, but it is actually profitable. Like, this is good ethics pays. That if you're doing good things, then it's naturally going to lead to profitability. And I think that comes from a kind of, I mean, just taking it on face value, I think it comes from a kind of common wisdom that, if you live a good life, you do good things, that good things will come to you. Why should that not be the case? But it turns out that being able to sort of establish this at an empirical level is pretty tough. And there's been a quest to sort of establish that good ethics leads to greater profitability for decades now. And I don't think there's any conclusive case about it. I don't think the relationship has ever been established. It's a really tough thing to prove at the end of the day, because you have to come to some kind of agreeable definition about what is good or what is ethical. And people are going to have disagreements about this. Are cigarettes unethical? Seems like most people say that they are unethical, but other people would have different perspectives. That's probably a stupid example, but you can think of ones that are a little bit more sort of in a gray area. But it's not just about what industry the company is in, but it's also about a host of other kinds of relationships that the corporation has that are just really difficult to categorize in terms of ethics. So I don't know if that answers the question. There's throughout most of the 20th century, when people were talking about the social responsibilities of business, there was a bit of a recognition that there was going to be some kind of trade-off between doing what's right for these workers or doing what's right for this community and short-term profit. But what you see with the rise of finance in the late 20th century is a business ethics that's been kind of transformed more into the image of a financialized U.S. economy that makes the case that actually there's no trade-off, and that we can solve the profitability problem because actually good ethics pays. And ESG is sort of one of the recent iterations of that kind of project.
I often wonder how the good ethics pays people feel when they watch a movie like It's a Wonderful Life, which centrally involves the protagonist, George Bailey, having to make this difficult decision between, do I do what clearly seems like do I take the profitable path and collude with Potter and become a slumlord, or do I?
He could go to Europe on some vacations,
That's right. smoking big cigars, driving big cars, or does he do the righteous thing and stick up for the little man? In the end, he does the righteous thing and it works out for him, but arguably as a result of a miracle, the intervention of this angel. But this kind of difficult, you could use the term trade-off, this kind of trade-off that is, I think, totally intelligible. You have to sort of give that up if you buy into the good ethics pays perspective. I know we're not here to like hash it out and say who wins the argument, but that aspect of the view makes it a sort of tough for me to accept it, because it seems there are so many clear instances where there is a trade-off, and you will hurt yourself economically by doing the right thing, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are certainly many cases where you can align the interests of
Sure.
people in the stakeholder world and business schools, and they talk about finding a way where a business or some sort of strategy is going to create value for everyone. And
Yeah.
I think there's, by and large, I mean, I think there's plenty of circumstances where that's the case. How could it not be? If it weren't the case, then we would have a pretty big like legitimation problem with regard to American business. But on the other hand, there's a tremendous amount of coercion, for example, in labor markets in which people just don't have a lot of options for the kind of work they'd like to pursue. I think labor is a really important thing to keep an eye on when you're trying to discuss these problems, because the history of the United States is filled with just tremendous, sometimes very violent outbreaks of conflict between workers and people who are not workers. And so it just seems on its face, prima facie, it's hard for me to even take all that seriously, that you're always going to find some way to solve ethical commitments and profitability, because there is power. You have to contend with the problem of power. So
Looking at other questions, one concerns this figure that's pretty prominently featured in the book, Henry Mann, who I take it was something of he was an academic, but really kind of an activist as well for a libertarian perspective in economics, and helped found the institution that eventually was moved and became a key part of the big program up at George Mason.
Yeah,
kind of a more conservative leaning economics program. But he would tirelessly campaign for free market principles, it seems to me. And his argument was often something like, look, if you let these other factors intrude on the decision making of businesses, then the market's going to be more inefficient, and it's going to hurt, beyond just hurting the bottom line, it's going to wind up hurting the companies themselves in the short end, maybe, or definitely the long run, which will hurt jobs, and then it really hurt everyone. But I was thinking, it seems that you can advocate for free market principles, but that doesn't mean that's not the same thing as sort of only market principles. And I felt like in his arguments, the cases that he was making, he was kind of sliding from one to the other. Sure, he doesn't want government activity or mandates interfering with the activity of businesses, but on the other hand, he's saying businesses should only decide on the value of profitability for the shareholders. Which to me is different than saying you shouldn't be interfered with by the state. He's saying there's only one thing that matters when it comes to the doing of business. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it that way, in a sense, what he's saying is it's like tautologically true. Yeah, if you bring in any other values besides the value of making money, that's going to hurt your ability to make money, because in a way, your values have been compromised. But on the other hand, when you put it this way, surely almost everyone would agree there's more that is of value in life than just money. And so we're constantly having to make these trade-offs. We're having to put these things in different hierarchical arrangements, and we choose money in some cases, and we choose family in others, and we choose time with friends in other cases. I guess I wondered if anyone ever pushed back on him and said, sure, anytime you value anything besides only profitability, that will hurt the campaign for profitability. But isn't this the way of human life? Do you know if that kind of response was ever marshaled against him and how he might have responded?
Yeah. Yeah, Henry Manny is a very interesting character, and he's a devoted, what I think what he would describe himself as a classical liberal. Um, we would I think most people would conventionally think of him as a libertarian. He was enormously influential in American legal thinking in the late 20th and early 21st century. Partly as you say, because of his work in developing these law and economics programs um, up in Rochester originally, and then down in Florida, and then he eventually became the dean of the George Mason School of Law at what became the Antonin Scalia School of Law at George Mason, and his idea about law and economics was his approach was to basically take the neoclassical economic ideas and apply them to legal reasoning, and that movement just it transformed the way law professors and judges and legal theorists thought about problems of antitrust, for example. And Robert Bork is a good example of somebody who's very influenced by this way of thinking and transformed American antitrust law in the process. But Manny was very influenced by libertarian thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. And you know, I hesitate to put I hesitate to characterize him as someone who says that we should only care about money. I mean, he seems like a guy who had a pretty big personality and enjoyed the finer things of life. And I bet if you asked him that question, he would probably sort of laugh, but and he would probably very cleverly turn the question around um, in some interesting way. And he would say, I think he would say, the point is not that money is the end. The point is that markets driven by the motivations of profit are the only way to efficiently organize an economy that's as sophisticated and large and complicated as ours is. I think that's what he would say. My bone to pick with Henry Manny is that I don't think that he pays enough attention to institutions. My another way of saying that, it's not exactly the same way, but another way of saying that is he doesn't seem to be thinking about about power and about culture and about how institutions are structured by these things. I mean, he doesn't seem to think that the corporation is anything other than a um, a set of individuals who are just sort of maximizing their own economic interests. And so his view is that the second that you obfuscate that and you deny it, then you are heading towards a kind of dysfunction that's so profound that it's going to undo all of this economic growth and the kind of coordination that the market provides. But as I said in my opening comments briefly, I mean, I think that one of the things that I care about, and one of the things I think you you have to, I would hope that people would do is take the corporation as an institution really seriously. That they are, among other things, there's hierarchies within these firms, and there's cultures within these firms, and there are relationships of power within these firms. And I think that Henry Manny's approach, it essentially kind of deontologizes the whole thing. It empties out the social relationships within those institutions, and he rethinks it in terms of a kind of behavioral economics, really. So yeah, and maybe that also circles us back around to the question of ontology that you were raising earlier. Maybe we should talk about that. But
I think what you said is probably enough on the ontology point. Maybe a future paper on the metaphysics of corporations. That's a helpful response. And I also just wanted to hear you really have to make the libertarian case. You did it. You did it well. We've got an interesting question here. In talking about corporate social responsibility and ESG, and just more generally on the idea of good ethics paying, someone asked, well, whose ethics? Which I take it, is pointing out it's not like we all agree, like ethics is this list of things that everybody agrees on. And the only question is, are you going to apply it to what you're doing or not? Ethics itself is a hugely contested field. Politics is similarly contested. The person who asked the question also says, think about the recent case of Bud Light, incorporating a public figure in their advertising that they thought was going to appeal to their market, but in fact, it had they did not foresee that it would have the opposite effect, because it broke down along political lines and actually alienated a huge component of their market. And so that, I think, I don't know, that I would like to hear you sort of free associate about the question of whose ethics, whose politics, as regards good ethics pays or good politics pays in these kinds of questions. And
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. Thanks for the question. I think one of the things that's happening in our political culture right now is that there's a sort of great sorting of political identities. And so political identities are coming to, they're becoming like these sort of greedy categories that are gobbling up more and more areas of life. And so what I mean by that, at least in this case, is that consumer preferences are getting sorted along political lines, and this puts and this also gets to the question about whose ethics, right? One ethical perspective would be that that brands have an ethical obligation to reach out to ever greater a number of political and social identities, embracing causes of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so on and so forth. But that itself is obviously a kind of normative ethical commitment, a certain that is associated with a certain kind of politics. And we live in a moment where there's just intense disagreement about the very basics of these kinds of ethical commitments. I think this puts CEOs and managers and people in public relations in a very challenging position, right? Because there's an expectation, because so much of our social, cultural, and economic life is becoming politicized, tethered to political identities. There's an expectation that from many consumers, and especially sometimes from employees within firms, that the corporation take a stand on a certain issue. Now, in a case like, for example, Black Lives Matter, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, there was a pretty uniform and widespread demand from a lot of professional middle-class employees and many consumers that the corporations take a stand and sort of say, we support Black Lives Matter. But it seems to me like that was a pretty exceptional moment, and pretty quickly widespread support for those kinds of initiatives sort of it declined and it withered. And now I think you see just a lot more partisanship, a lot more disagreement. And I think consumers are getting wise to this, right? So when Bud Light puts out this, I forget exactly the arrangement I think they had a pretty small, fairly insignificant sort of arrangement with an Instagram influencer that had some that was speaking and representing LGBT interests, LGBTQ interests, and it seems like the kind of thing that at a different moment no one would have noticed. I mean, it's not as if Bud Light put a lot of money into this campaign. It wasn't all that significant. But I think that, yeah, again, consumers and others are getting wise to this and noticing, okay, well, you've basically made your decision, Bud Light brand. You've put your brand in with this political tribe, and then it elicits a tremendous backlash. And so that's a roundabout answer to this question, but I think it's a good one. I think that um, executives, PR professionals are in a kind of a bind because on the one hand, there's an expectation that they speak out on certain issues. On the other hand, they're going to alienate a good chunk of their consumers potentially if they do.
And it also, as the person asked the question pointed out, it's when you say good ethics pays, the next question should be, well, whose ethics? So there's a question
Right,
of
right.
how do you think about that? But if we're just thinking in terms of trying to be ethical while at the same time, investing your money, or while at the same time running a corporation, the Bud Light case is interesting because I think they were by their lights, they were trying to be ethical. I think they were trying to do what they thought people would respect as an ethical decision. And it's not, it really doesn't seem like it paid off for them in this case.
No,
So
no.
it's, depending on how you set up the question, the statement of what it means to say that good ethics pays, this is the candidate counterexample, to use philosophical language. It may be a case where
Yeah,
it looks like, at least trying to do the right thing, setting aside whether it really is, or but trying to do the right thing may not always pay.
yeah, yeah,
Of
yeah,
course, they
yeah.
can always say, well, just give us, in the long run, give us 10 more years. The decision will come back to repay us
There's
dividends.
always
I
a
don't know.
different, yeah, there's always another lens you can use. But I think you're right. Yeah, and I think that's what I find so irritating about some of these lists, for example, about there was one that came out last month, the Just 100 list. Just Capital puts out this list about the 100 top, most just companies. You look into the methodology, you look into the categories, and it's basically a black box. How could it be otherwise? They're using categories of ethics and justice that reach down to the very, these are very basic moral questions. But it's a handful of smart people that figured out these categories in a room and then applied it to a bunch of disclosure data. And it just seems to me to ring pretty false. But it gets a lot of press, and at least in the business press, and people use it for their corporate branding and that kind of thing. But it seems it's pretty thin. It's pretty thin stuff.
Going back to the question queue here, someone asks, is there some possibility that entities such as JP Morgan, Chase, or Bank of America, or venture capital groups will attempt to enforce a particular social or ethical discipline on corporations through focused allocations of capital or financial services? What are the implications of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get on that. I touch on that in a book, the last chapter and in the conclusion. Um, the title of that conclusion is Larry Fink president of the world? Larry Fink, of course, the head of a massive investment fund, the largest in the world, if it still is, but it's up there, right? When an investment firm like BlackRock or Vanguard says that we're going to allocate capital around these certain social or ethical categories, such as they have done with ESG, that has sort of that has distorting effects with regard to capital markets, right? Simply because of the scale of it. I
Hmm.
mean, it affects valuations, it affects the development of industries, and surely this is this is one of the motivations behind an ESG movement, right? That it would hasten the transition away from fossil fuels, for example, and toward renewables. And so the explicit goal is to effectively shrink, oil and natural gas production. Um, the reason, I mean, it raises the question, why? Well, I think thinking about it in those terms really gets to the heart of the matter of why it's become so controversial, right? Because I think we recognize that these are basically political questions about the direction of the economy, and it's one thing in the form of economic planning or industrial policy for the United States by means of its democratically elected representatives to sort of direct economic policy like Joe Biden has done in his time in office. It's another thing for Wall Street fund managers to do that. And I think that raises big questions about how we think about the effectiveness of democracy, how we think about how big problems can be solved in our society. And I think that there are well-meaning people on the ESG side, people who are supportive of it. And many of them will say that finance and corporations are the last institution capable of really solving big problems. Yeah, in partnership with government, in partnership with the state, but they really have to take the lead on it. But these are regardless of where you stand on climate change, and certainly we're in the midst of a kind of a crisis. You have to, I mean, I think you have to admit that these are basic political questions, and to put them in the hands of private finance is, well, it's a kind of concession that democracy is not working, for one thing. But I think it also is, it will provoke a kind of backlash, which it certainly has. So,
yeah, that's interesting. We only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to get in another question here. A listener asks, what do you think are the major impacts of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision? Is there any reasonable likelihood that it can be overturned?
yeah, the Citizens United decision is interesting. I mean, it's one of the reasons that one of the events that caused me to get interested in the history of the corporation. I was in college, and I read about the Citizens United decision. I was struck by, like many people were at the time, corporations are people. What is this? How can this possibly be the case? And that set me on a long historical journey and thinking and discovering the long history of corporate legal personhood that goes way, way back into the Middle Ages and even into the ancient world. And so corporate personhood is a necessary feature of any society is going to have any kind of advanced social or economic organizations. You need to have an organizational person that can contract, that can exist in law. But the Citizens United decision is exceptional because it said that corporations are persons with First Amendment protections, and that spending money in campaigns is a kind of form of speech that with Constitution protections. And so the question about whether it can be overturned or will be overturned, I don't know. I can't speculate about that. It seems like there's been a movement to try to repeal it for a number of years, and it hasn't gotten much traction. So I don't feel super bullish about that. The question about its influence, that's an important question. One thing that certainly happened in the last 15 years is that the American political system has been transformed by money, and one of the major consequences of that is that the parties don't have the kind of control that they had in primaries and exerting basically party discipline. That there's just so much outside money that's changed the game. It seems to me like that's pretty tough. That's a tough genie to put back into the bottle. People have been talking about campaign finance reform for 20 years now, and there's been certain steps to solve those problems, but I don't think that there's going to be a one trick to fix it. So, yeah, that's my reaction to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're out of time. I do want to say before we go our separate ways, thank you, Kyle, for writing this book and for sharing your time with us tonight. Interesting discussion. I think many of our listeners would agree with me that it's fascinating stuff. Thank you
Paul.
also. Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and the Hedgehog Review for sponsoring this event. Thank you to the attendees who joined us and asked questions. Thanks for coming and listening. And again, a reminder, if you're interested, join us on April 23rd for Tal Brewer discussing his essay, The Great Malformation, the perils of child rearing in a digital age. Thanks again, and hope everyone has a good night.